Walking into the pub that afternoon, I have to admit I was shaken up. Weeks earlier, when Jackie had told us about his strange encounter, we had all expected him to simply shrug it off. Now I looked back sympathetically and honestly started to regret being so expectant of him. I had seen nothing clearly, only heard the stories second and third hand, yet I felt as if every ounce of energy had been drained from me. I knew with my rudimentary understanding of biology that this was probably what is called an adrenaline dump. I was in a state of heightened awareness when Claudette snuck up on me, and again when she mentioned the thing about the hands. 2 huge jolts of adrenaline that my body was now paying the price for not using. I couldn't imagine how Jackie must have felt after seeing what he saw and wished that I had been more sympathetic to his cause. As it turned out, I was clearly not very good at hiding my feelings. As soon as I walked into the bar, everyone seemed to notice, though only Diane spoke up.
What the hell happened to you? You look like death warmed up. Come in and sit down for God's sake. I'll get you one on the house.
Usually, beer was my poison, but I saw as she spoke that Diane was reaching to the top shelf for something stronger, and for once I did nothing to refuse the offer. The other guys perched at the bar looked concerned, and one of them slapped me reassuringly on the back. A simple gesture, but one meant to show that I was now safe and amongst friends, where I could share whatever it was that had put me in such a state. So I did. I told them, again in more detail, about the incident with Claudette and the werewolf. Then I told them what she revealed to me that evening, and particularly the detail about the hands. I knew even before mentioning it how that coincidence, that shared data between 2 totally unrelated sightings, was going to chill the others to the bone just like it had me. When I'd finished relating my story, there were a few moments during which the bar was entirely silent. Eventually, though, that silence was broken by Diane, reaching for 5 shot glasses into which she poured doses of the same medicine she had prescribed for me.
There's no way,
Diane said softly.
No way that she could have known that. I mean, that makes it sound like...
Like I was telling the truth all along.
Jackie interrupted.
Yeah, I was. I know I add some embellishments to stories sometimes, all in the interests of spinning a good yarn, but I'm telling you, on my mother's grave, I saw what I saw.
Though he felt the need to underscore the truth of his story, Jackie needn't have bothered. We all believed him. Again, the bar fell silent. Then, after a long, loud inhalation as if he were storing up the oxygen to say everything he was about to say in a single breath, Woody decided to speak.
Did I ever tell you fellas about the Skinwalkers in Arizona?
We all exchanged glances, wondering just how relevant this tall tale was likely to be to the discussion. Woody, we all knew, had spent a considerable amount of time in the military, and similar to Jackie, had travelled to many places that most in Morton had only seen on TV. Often when his stories started in this way, it was because the details were things that would be unverifiable. Woody would tell us what a friend he'd met overseas had told him, or about an incident that happened far away in a place we were unlikely to visit where he was unexpectedly the hero. The distance and the inability to check the details made his lies a little more plausible. In this case, however, perhaps because of the situation or perhaps because of the way he told it, I believed every word.
I was in the US once, in New Orleans, but I had a mate there who was stationed in Arizona. We were talking one night about weird stuff, and he got onto the subject of what he called skinwalkers. He said that the First Nations believed in them and they were basically shapeshifters.
Normally that kind of talk would have been enough for us to blow froth from the top of our beers, snorting with laughter. Somehow, though, that day, it seemed perfectly reasonable.
According to him, these things are a species apart. They don't fit into our categories and they hunt by imitating other things. He said he had a close friend who'd actually seen one.
As Woody said this, using almost word for word the dreaded phrase, "a friend of a friend," I'll admit my credulity alarm went off. Of course, I'd heard of the concepts of shapeshifters and skinwalkers before, and the idea would certainly seem to fit with what had been going on recently, but still. I let Woody continue nonetheless.
He said he had seen one once whilst travelling at night. He was driving cross-state and had managed to miss his turning. There was nothing on the road for miles around and only fields stretching out on either side, so he stopped the car altogether and got out to check his map and take a leak. He said he spread the map on the roof of the car, and looked at it using a flashlight. This was in the days before every phone had a torch on it, you understand.
To my right, Terry, who was a noted technophobe, raised his eyebrows as if to show that he was more surprised by the idea that phones now have flashlights on them than the concept of skinwalkers. But he didn't interrupt.
Once he'd had a good look and figured out which turning he'd missed, he put the map back in the car and wandered down to the fence to have a pee. He had clamped the torch between his teeth and was attending to business when he happened to look up at the cows standing in the field in front of him. He told me in all seriousness that he saw one of those cows sitting upright on its haunches, like a man sitting in a chair. Its forelegs were completely off the ground and hanging by its sides in a way he didn't even know cows could do. He said that the thing just sat there, straight-backed as if it was enjoying a morning coffee, and stared at him. He zipped up, pulled the torch out of his mouth, and shone on the thing to get a better look, and this is where it gets weird. He swears that the thing had a human face. Not fully, but even though the head was cow-shaped with a snout and everything, it had a human nose, stretched out over those bovine bones, human eyes pulled way too far from where the sockets should be, and a mouth that wanted just a straight line, or that curved under the muzzle, but which sat straight at the front of the face, with 2 rows of teeth like man. He said the thing was silent, but that the face seemed like it was sliding or palsied, slipping to one side as if the bones beneath the skin were changing or moving around.
What did he do?
Asked Terry breathlessly.
What do you think he did? He ran to his car and sped off as quick as he possibly could without ever looking back.
Woody shook his head and accepted from Diane the harder, shorter drink she had offered to calm the nerves. He sank it in one, and to my surprise, continued after what I had assumed was the end of his story.
Thing is, my friend whose mate it was that saw this thing said he had laughed at him, called him daft, and told him to stop drinking before he drove. He had not believed a word of it, and had always believed until recently that things like that were utter nonsense. Now, obviously, that until recently left room for me to ask what had changed, and why he had suddenly decided to take his friend's story more seriously, so I did. Then he got real quiet and said he would only tell me later when we were back at his place, because he didn't know who might be listening. I mean, how could you resist something that dramatic? So we had a few more drinks, talked about something else, and then went back to his place for a few after-hours drinks, and I asked him the same question again. He looked really sheepish, checked through the window that there was no one around, then sat down opposite me and swore me to secrecy before he'd tell me. He's dead now, so I suppose it doesn't matter much, and I doubt the US military is going to come looking for secrets in the Anchor pub in Morton, so I can probably tell you guys. He said that he was once stationed at a base in Arizona when one of the senior officials, who was a good friend of his, asked if he had ever seen anything unusual whilst out on patrols. He said no, but shared his friend's Skinwalker story, expecting the officer to laugh. He didn't. Instead, he told my friend to meet him at 2300 hours in the same spot, because he had something to show him. Of course, my friend did as he was told, and he was led into an elevator and down several floors below where his usual clearance would allow. The senior officer said that he was showing my friend this because he wanted him to be aware when he was on patrols that many of the other officers knew about it already, but that they were sworn to secrecy. He was then led to a small white room. One wall was two-sided glass so he could see in, but nobody inside could see out. At that point, however, there was nobody in the room anyway. Just blank whitewashed walls, a white painted floor, and a horrible fluorescent strip light above. In the dead center of the room, there was a brilliant white cube that was actually almost invisible against the white walls and floor. The cube was about 3 feet by 3 feet and had no other markings on it. It was the only furniture in the room. My friend was then told to look into the room and say what he saw. When he answered, "White," the senior officer nodded and replied, "Exactly." Moving to my friend's right, he pressed a small button, and from a space in the top left hand of the room, a drawer around 4 inches long opened, and a single fly emerged from it. At first, the fly crawled along the edge of the drawer, then it took off circling the room, and standing out for more than it ever would in a normal room because of the contrast between its black body and legs and the whiteness of the room. As my friend watched, he said something began to happen to the cube in the center of the room, as if its surface had begun to bubble. Then, as he watched on in astonishment, a swelling appeared on the surface. A long, thin cylinder, like a stick or pole, began to swell. He said this cylinder began to push and rise off the surface with white still clinging to it, like a stretch of melted cheese from a lifted piece of pizza. As one end raised, it sharpened and began all at once to turn black, the color leaking up the length of the cylinder as it seemed to harden and solidify, forming itself into more pointed shapes and harder angles. Joins appeared as the thing began to sprout thick black hairs, and all at once my friend recognized the shape as a leg, an insect's leg, like those of the single fly buzzing around the room. It can take the shape of anything it sees or has seen, but it needs the stimulus to keep changing or to maintain. Put it in a white box with no other stimulus, and all it can do is imitate the shape of the box. It is trapped by the lack of stimulus. Give it something else to look at or imitate, and voila. These things exist and they're out there. They can form into anything solid, tissue, bone, or hard objects. Oh, and they eat meat. That was all the information he was given and all the information he gave me. I honestly wasn't really sure whether to believe him or not until now. But think about it. Maybe the hands being wrong, on the feet I mean. Maybe it's a glitch, an imperfection. Maybe these things work the way AI does with images. It doesn't imitate perfectly like making a double of someone. It takes loads of little fragments of data, loads of information, and images and tries to combine them to make something new. The way that AI can make a human face that doesn't exist by taking traits and qualities from millions of photos of other people who do exist. But think about it, AI still doesn't do hands well. It's one of the ways you can tell something is AI. Maybe these shifters have similar problems. They see the image and try to mimic it, but they can't quite get it right every time. In every switch and every mimic, there are imperfections that are like dead giveaways, things you'd be able to spot a mile off as being just a little bit wrong. I mean, feet would make sense because most people wear shoes. It would have seen hands, and if it had never seen feet, it just decided that the things on the bottom must be the same as hands. It makes a weird kind of sense when you think about it.
The idea was nuts, but I had to admit it did make a weird kind of sense. Perhaps the thing that Claudette saw was an amalgam, a mix of a dog and human that the thing had seen and tried to combine. Perhaps the thing that Jackie had seen was an imitation of a woman, but with the giveaway flaw that Woody had mentioned, the tiny tell would let you know that this thing wasn't human.
You know,
Woody said after a pause,
I read once about something called the uncanny valley. Basically, it's the reason that humans get unnerved by dolls, mannequins, and even clowns because their painted smiles are a little too wide. We are hardwired to feel fear of anything that looks almost human but isn't. Now, this thing I read asked the question, why did we evolve that? What was it in humanity's past that made it necessary for us to be able to spot things that are not quite human? I mean, that's creepy, right? It's creepy because it implies two things. Firstly, if we needed to be able to tell if something looked almost human, then it implies that there are or were things that fit that bill, things that are almost human, looking enough to deceive us if we didn't have that instinct. But more than that, it implies that if these things did exist, then we needed some kind of defense against them. Why would we have evolved to be able to spot them on sight and single them out, if not because they were a threat or because they were dangerous? Going back to my mate in the US, he said that the First Nations, what some of you would call Native Americans, believed quite strongly in the idea of skinwalkers and shapeshifters. They talked about these things as being real, being amongst us, and being dangerous, because according to them, the reason we needed to be able to spot them is because they can spot us, and to them we are prey.
It was not long after Woody finished that sentence that the five of us decided that something needed to be done. If, and it was a big if, but if there was such a thing roaming the streets and moors of our town, then we would need to act. To find it and to kill it before it killed any of us.